All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Screen Review. Again, my name is Megan.
And I'm Dina.
All right. Today, we are going to be reviewing 13th, a 2016 Netflix documentary that's focused on the 13th Amendment's loophole, where slavery was abolished, except in the case of being a punishment for a crime. But we'll go ahead and put out there that this is rated TVMA. So it's about a 100-minute running time. And Dina, why don't you go ahead and describe the movie a little bit and tell us why you liked it?
So basically, the movie kind of discusses the prison industrial complex in America. And it's kind of crazy that this movie came out in 2016, yet it has like so much prevalence right now to this day. The movie kind of starts off with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and it kind of which abolished slavery, so to say, and kind of goes into how that kind of leads to the prison system we have today. And yeah, anything you want to add?
Not really, pretty much covered it. I like how this documentary really takes us from right with the ratification of the 13th Amendment all the way back to modern times with, like you said, the prison industrial complex, prison labor, and everything in our criminal justice system today. So the beginning of the documentary, it'll show a map of the United States, and it's a Barack Obama voiceover where he says the U.S. is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. The United States currently, and in 2016 when this was released, has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. So basically how we're going to frame this segment is we'll take each piece of the documentary in kind of chronological order. So Dina, anything you'd like to add right now?
No, but I can say how it starts. So it starts with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Well, after that whole excerpt with Obama narrating with the map of America. And it kind of starts with the ratification and the prison boom immediately after, where the 13th Amendment, like in quotes, says, basically to paraphrase, says that and no slavery is illegal other than for a punishment for a crime. So it kind of, the documentary starts with the ratification of the 13th Amendment and then shows that loophole that they took with slavery being in prisons.
Definitely. And I will note after that in times of slavery, slaves were integral to the economy of the South. So when this 13th Amendment was ratified, the South, just after being decimated by the Civil War, kind of was in a tough spot. And so that's why I believe that this loophole was created in the 13th Amendment, because a lot of the newly freed slaves were immediately arrested again and put right back into the same system they were before for something as simple as loitering or even vagrancy or being homeless. It was just small petty crimes like that led to, again, another lifetime of servitude.
Right. It was really just to rebuild the Southern economy with the slave labor. Right.
And so next, the documentary kind of shifts to the 1915 release of the movie The Birth of a Nation.
That movie kind of was known to reinstate the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, in America, and kind of gave them new ideas like burning the cross, which wasn't a thing before this movie, Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, exactly. Even the director of the movie, D.W. Griffith, he just randomly thought of the idea. He thought it'd be a cool cinematic thing to have his depiction of KKK members burn a cross, and then it was actually adopted by them. I will also say that the sitting president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, got a private screening of the movie, and he said that it was, quote, history written with lightning. And this movie just did an awful portrayal of Black people at the time. It was definitely helped shape the vision at that time.
Right. Yeah.
So next, we'll kind of transition into the murder of Emmett Till.
So basically, the murder of Emmett Till was like a lynching case, which was basically all he did was, it was a 14-year-old boy who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after he was accused of offending a white woman in a family grocery store. And that was a huge case. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I will say that not only did they murder this 14-year-old boy, they absolutely it was horrific what they did. And the mother chose to have an open casket funeral so that everyone that would attend, and thousands attended the funeral, could see what happened to her son. And a lot of people credit this as being a major catalyst for the civil rights movement. But first, we're going to go into more of the Jim Crow and segregation era.
Right. So the Jim Crow, kind of before that started, there was a lot of terrorism after the 13th Amendment was ratified. There was a lot of terrorism towards people of color. So from that, the Jim Crow laws were kind of put into effect, where it kind of gave more terrorist crimes kind of a legal loophole, so to say, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was definitely a horrible thing at that time. And then the documentary then kind of transitions into the civil rights movement. And I will go ahead and throw in a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here. He said, "For years I have been told to wait. The wait has always meant never. Justice too long delayed is justice denied."
Yeah, that's a good quote. So basically, with like the civil rights movement, they kind of started to argue that the civil rights movement kind of was illegal in a sense, and they tried, like the government tried to say that the civil rights movement caused more violence, therefore more imprisonment in America, which kind of did cause more imprisonment.
Yeah, many of the I guess activists at the time in the civil rights movement considered it a badge of honor to be arrested for the cause that they were fighting for, as it was. You know, it should not be illegal to fight for basic human rights.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it kind of, the civil rights movement kind of led to a lot of imprisonment. It kind of like escalated from there, escalated a lot throughout the years, the prison rates.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then when the Civil Rights Act was passed, that leads us a little bit down the road. We're now in the 1970s with the mass incarceration first coming about and the birth of law and order politics. So if you want to go ahead and just briefly talk about law and order politics.
Right. The law and order politics was like a huge theme throughout the entire documentary. It kind of, near the end, it was kind of like, kind of went full circle with that. It kind of was this whole thing where it started with dog whistle movements, where politicians at the time, it was President Nixon, said that crime was really from the liberation movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, like the feminist movement, like the LGBTQ plus rights movement, etc. And kind of politicians wanted to arrest all of these activists, which was like the law and order kind of era, I guess, where it started. And there's this quote that said that no one is above the law and no one is below the law. And kind of most activists became public enemy number one in a sense.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, Nixon coined the term the war on crime. He was the law and order president. And at this time, I will point out that the documentary does something where it'll take you from the point in time that it's talking about, right now, 1970, and tell you the prison population in the United States at that time. And as you move through the decades all the way up to 2014, 2016, modern times for this documentary, they update you with it. So at the time in 1970, the prison population was 357,292.
Yeah.
So as we go through it, I'll update you more on the information, but as I'm sure you could guess with the theme of the documentary, that number absolutely explodes.
Right.
I will also say that one of Nixon's advisors on his law and order kind of politics and the war on drugs, the war on crime, he said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war on black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this documentary does a really nice job of taking poignant quotes and just highlighting them to kind of illustrate what it was like in the nation at that time, all the way up to modern times. It'll bring you.
Yeah, and that quote actually came like years after they kind of started that whole thing, and it was actually called the Southern Strategy, which is what Nixon used, which kind of like convinced people to vote for him, right?
Yeah. Definitely. Now, in order to have a political edge, Nixon started this whole idea of being tough on crime. If you weren't the tough on crime candidate, you most likely weren't elected. So, yeah, kind of moving past that to the more tough on crime candidates were now met at the Reagan era in terms of the documentary.
And something I actually liked about the documentary is when it went from each like presidential era and each decade, like around the same time, it would show the amount of people in prisons. It kind of, there was a song, and every song would kind of relate to the next topic you would go to, and they would show the lyrics like on the screen, which I liked, and it kind of like segued into a new topic of discussion related to the prison industrial
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I definitely like their use of songs throughout the whole entire movie to kind of weave together all the talking points, as well as, I forgot to mention earlier, but the whole entire documentary, it's coupled with quotes from periods of time, statistics, facts, figures, and as well as historical experts and scholars' opinions on everything that's happening with the, like you said, the prison industrial complex, the 13th Amendment, and modern day times in 2016. So I really like that about the documentary.
And they did get someone good or big in there. They got Angela Davis, which was probably one of the most, like, I guess, well-known scholars, or not, she's an activist, but well-known people in this area. Documentary, which I really like, that they got like names that people would recognize, as well as names people don't really recognize, but you kind of have like a new appreciation for scholars of this topic, which I thought was really cool.
Exactly. Yeah, they would put the name of the scholar when they were giving their opinion or their interview. They would also put, you know, where they teach or what they've done, things like that. That way, you know, it's most likely someone's opinion that's worth something. Yeah. So, yeah, continuing to the Reagan era, a lot of the scholars attributed Reagan to turning the rhetorical term used by Nixon, the war on drugs, into a real one by declaring it in 1982 officially.
Right. And with the war on drugs, Reagan was like super, like very adamant about it, and he talked about it a lot, and his wife was even in on it, where he had a Just Say No campaign to drugs, which in the documentary they talk a lot more highly on his wife's campaign, Just Say No, just because it wasn't as forceful as Reagan's war on drugs, literal war on drugs. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is now we're brought to the 1980s, and I will say this is when crack cocaine first started hitting the streets, and this is also the first time of the record time that on the floor was enforced into a law with mandatory sentencing for crack. So for 1 ounce of crack, you'd get the same you'd get 100 times worse of a sentence for getting the same amount of powder cocaine. So it was almost at a point where it was worse in the government's eye to have the just solid form of the same drug, essentially.
Yeah, and the and the thing about the Reagan era was that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer because he had a huge economic crisis in his time as president, which had a lot to do with the crack cocaine epidemic, because health insurance was getting very pricey, and they started to treat this epidemic not as an epidemic, but more of a criminal kind of offense, rather than like worrying for citizens' health.
Exactly.
A lot of the time, addiction is, you know, you go to rehab centers, you go to a hospital, but he was treating it more as
a criminal issue.
As a criminal issue, right?
Definitely. So that after that time, another problem with the crack cocaine being introduced onto the streets is that it was much more accessible for lower income areas because it was so much cheaper. Right. So a lot of people were saying that the powder cocaine, which is more expensive and considered a higher class drug, why was that getting less sentencing than the cheaper version?
Right, because they said once that cocaine was more sophisticated than crack.
Exactly.
So evidently they would be treated as different crimes, and it was especially because crack was more common in the neighborhoods with people of color, rather than many white people had more cocaine on them, right?
Exactly.
So it became this whole, like, it's not really a matter of the drug itself. It's like who has it kind of things, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so then we'll segue now, kind of getting more into the 90s, moving out of the 80s. I will go ahead and say that 1980, the prison population was 513,900. By 1985, it was 759,100.
Yeah, in the documentary at this point, they said that after the crack epidemic, huge chunks of the Black community just disappeared into prisons, like completely just like families were split in half. People grew up without fathers. It was insane.
Yeah, a lot of the scholars attributed the Nixon and Reagan administrations for having devastated all communities of color.
Right.
Just based on their policies and everything, and the after effects of everything that was done by the administrations.
Yeah.
So then we'll move on to the term super predators.
So basically, the super predators were the kids who grew up without their dads, because it was usually Black men who were imprisoned. So these were kids who grew up without their dads and were kind of put into gangs, so to say, as they say in the news. And they became old enough to kind of get charged as adults. And even some of them weren't old enough to be charged as adults, but were anyway. And something about this time was the media. And obviously the media has so much power. And sometimes, the power can be a little misconstrued. So the news would constantly televise people of color as criminals, they would show them in handcuffs walking towards a cop car, not nearly as much as white criminals. And it wasn't even like a matter of like they were just arresting people. Like statistically, like the news was wrong. They were not showing an even ratio, I guess you could say, according to the actual statistics of people in prison, right? So yeah. And from the super predator, we kind of get into the Central Park 5 jogger case, which was a huge thing.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, it was a few kids, 5 kids, under the age, mostly under the age of 18, and they were essentially convicted guilty of a crime that DNA proved they were innocent. They were sentenced to adult prison, many of them under the age of 18, for 6 to 8 years. And essentially what this period of time in the documentary, what they're showing us about super predators, is that we're educated to believe that people of color are criminals.
Right.
That's just what they're showing.
Right. And they were trying to show that like there was like this pressure for someone to be blamed for this case. And so they kind of just thought, oh, who's most likely, not actually, but in their minds, who's most likely to be able to be accused, right? So they just it was kind of like picking out of a hat who they were going to put in prison, right?
Exactly. And next, I'm just going to touch on the presidential race. It was Dukakis versus Bush. And Dukakis had a double-digit lead over Bush until the Bush campaign released their Willie Horton campaign, showing that Bush was the candidate that was going to be tough on crime. As we'll hear this, they have a lot of major themes that go through this, one of them being law and order, one of them being tough on crime, one of them just criminals. And essentially what it was exposing Dukakis's ability to have convicted murderers, have free passes on the weekends, and Bush would never let that happen. And after they released that Willie Horton campaign, Bush ultimately won the presidency, as we all know.
Yeah.
And so then after 1988, a lot of the Democratic candidates began to see that they needed to be a little bit tougher on crime if they wanted to secure the seat of the president. And so then that's where Bill Clinton comes in.
Right.
You can go ahead and talk about that. Okay. So he's the one who had the 3 strikes and you're out policy. So what it was is if you were convicted of 3 felonies, on your 3rd felony conviction, you're mandated to go to prison for life. He would have the mandatory sentencing, the minimum sentencing, and this is attributed for another one of the major prison booms. So from 1985, there was a prison population of 759,100. In 1990, it was 1,179,200 people. So just from there, just in those 5 years.
And a lot of the problem at that time was that there was so many cases that a lot of people would just be stuck in this limbo of like they're not on trial yet. And as well, not just that, but also parole was slowly being ignored, right? So people were just kind of like imprisoned for
just sitting, just waiting.
Just waiting, yeah.
I will also, in 1994,
Mm-hmm.
President Clinton passed a $30 billion federal crime bill, which a lot of people attribute for the modern day militarization of the police. It got them all of the extra gear that they have essentially in here.
Yeah. And it was kind of, yeah. And then after that segment, something that like really stood out to me in this movie was that in a history class, when you see stuff about the civil rights movement, you see it in black and white. I've always seen it in black and white. But in this documentary, they show Martin Luther King Jr. in color film, which kind of like confused me because I was like, oh, I remember that seeing all of this stuff in black and white because it was probably like one of those things where they wanted you to think it was so much longer ago, but really this wasn't as long ago as we think it was, you know?
No.
There was color pictures, like it wasn't too long ago, and that was just something that really stood out to me.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
One of the major things, and we'll touch on it a little bit later, towards the end of the documentary, I loved the it was really powerful, the parallels they put between the civil rights movement in the 1960s to the modern day Black Lives Matter protests.
Right, yeah.
That was a really powerful ending sequence.
For sure. Yeah.
So another thing about the 1994 federal crime bill is that in recent years, Bill Clinton now has come out and admitted that bill was a mistake and that it forced people into prison that wouldn't normally be there. And that was another major contribution to the exploding prison population, because by 2000, it was 2 million people, a little over 2 million people. And so then now that will bring us to Trayvon Martin and Florida's Stand Your Ground law.
Yeah. So basically, the Trayvon Martin, I remember it like it was
I do
like
too.
I remember seeing it in the news and being like, oh my gosh. Basically, there was a man walking on the street named George Zimmerman, and he called the police because he thought that Trayvon Martin, a boy also walking on the street in Orlando, Florida, looked suspicious, and the police said, don't pursue, like don't do anything. And ultimately, George Zimmerman shot him. And even though the police told him to not do anything, but the problem was when they were going to trial, they couldn't arrest him because of a Florida law called Stand Your Ground law, which basically says that you can kill someone if you feel threatened at all. And so therefore, Zimmerman pleaded self-defense, and he was seen as non-guilty. And the rest is, yeah.
Yeah, it sparked protests all over the nation. People were outraged by this. I mean, Trayvon Martin was 17 years old.
Right. Exactly. And he did nothing. So
exactly. And that will lead us now about the Stand Your Ground law to the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, which is another major point in this documentary. They talk about this for quite a while.
Pretty much the second half of the entire documentary is about this. It's called ALEC, and it's basically this kind of a group between politicians and corporations, and it's kind of basically just corporations lobbying lawmakers to help them, basically.
Essentially.
And so they're called like ALEC bills, right? And so something to relate it back to the Trayvon Martin case, Walmart, which sells guns, was a huge part of ALEC. They were huge donators, and they supported the Stand Your Ground law in Florida, which killed Trayvon Martin. But after the fact, after Trayvon Martin's case, Walmart pulled out of ALEC, but they still to this day do donate to the corporation.
Yeah,
kind of related back to Trayvon Martin's case.
Exactly. So essentially, what ALEC does is what Dina said. It's a private club where lawmakers and leaders of corporations can come and they discuss essentially what laws corporations would like passed. A lot of the times the corporations will write the laws, and then everyone in the private club will vote on them together, and then the lawmakers will decide whether or not they want to bring it to the floor. And I remember one of the important things I remember from the documentary was it was a video of a lawmaker introducing a bill that he wanted to be a law, and another lawmaker there saw that the header on the bill that he was proposing was found exactly the same way on the ALEC website.
Yeah. And something about Alec was that they had a lot of corporations in their kind of secret club, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was a huge correctional treatment facility in America, CCA. And this really is how we get into the prison systems we have today,
Mm-hmm.
where it's really just for money. So basically, correctional treatment facilities, which kind of give prisoners to prison, um, um, basically get paid to keep prisons filled by Alec, right? So it's kind of like a growth industry, right? And from that came like mandatory sentencing laws, the three strikes laws. These are all Alec bills that by result helped the CCA, making them rich off of punishments, so that Alec and CCA helped one another with this like rapid increase in criminalization.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And they had a $1.7 billion profit off of some of these things.
Right.
I remember one of the cases, I believe they was $11 million a month in profit or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the case that you're about to talk about. It's called SB 1070, which was an Alec bill that allowed officers to stop anyone that looked like an illegal immigrant. Even children were detained, and this is where like what we see now, detention centers started.
Mm-hmm.
That is what was worth 11 million per month plus, and counting.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then after that, Alec received a lot of backlash for that, obviously. And so they made a kind of what some scholars would say as a smart PR move to say they want to be on the right side of criminal justice and reform after a lot of the corporations left after all the backlash for the SB 1070 law and all the other laws that they've made or proposed to become made. But essentially at that point, it's almost like the damage has already been done because now we're going to start getting into prison labor, the modern day prison industrial complex, and we'll continue from there.
Right. So basically, their prices. There was one point that they made with like prisons being more expensive, where they said that in Maryland, an hour and a half of a minimum wage job would be equivalent to being able to buy 10 minutes on the phone in prison with a family member, which is just insane to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had like serious prison labor where they were practically slaves, they were doing stuff for corporations. They would make clothing. The Idaho potatoes, are farmed by prisoners, and a lot of them at least. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of major corporations relied and do rely on prison labor to kind of create their products. Most notably in the documentary, they attributed Victoria's Secret and JCPenney to having relied on prison labor, but I believe they have stopped since. Because they received a lot of backlash for that because, like you said, it's a modern day form of slavery. Because you have an hour and a half, like you said, and you get a 10-minute phone call. That's what you can afford.
Right. And so from that, it kind of became apparent that poor people just can't get out of jail. Like if you don't have money, you can't get out of jail. Bail is so expensive, right? So then came up this whole topic of a man named Khalif Browder, right? So basically the whole thing with him was that they showed a statistic that 97%, I believe, of people locked up in prison just do a plea bargain and they don't even go to trial because they kind of almost punish you for saying you want to go to trial instead of doing a plea bargain. They say, oh, well, if you do a plea bargain before your trial, you get 10 years, but if you go to trial, you could get 30, So they got this whole thing with Khalif Browder.
Exactly. So Khalif Browder was arrested for a petty crime that he did not commit. And once he was arrested, everyone is almost pressuring him, just take the plea bargain, admit you're guilty, and you can go home right now. You'll go home right now if you just admit you're guilty. And he said, I'm not guilty, I'm innocent, and I want to go to trial. So when you're waiting for trial, he went to jail. And from that, he said he received beatings nearly every single day by guards and other prisoners alike. He attempted suicide multiple times in jail. And eventually he went into trial, and he got to leave because he was innocent.
And 2 years after he left, he eventually did hang himself. He committed suicide. And something in the movie is they had kind of a tribute to him that was like extremely emotional for me, at least.
It was.
It was so emotional, right? And so it was very sad. And I mean, obviously I don't know his mental state, but I'm assuming it was from his extremely brutal time in jail. They said in the documentary, they said that jail is kind of really meant to make a person withstand like 30 days. It's not this lifelong kind of thing. So yeah,
exactly. And I will say that he was 22 years old. Right. He was so young, and he spent so many years in prison. And exactly, you're right. I mean, people's mental state can withstand prison for 30 days. He was there for 3 years. I can't imagine that. He couldn't call his family. He was just beaten every single day. I mean, that would it would wreak havoc on anyone's mental health, of course. And a lot of the scholars say that jail was designed to desensitize humans.
Like, people aren't meant to be in jail, basically.
Exactly. They said, you wouldn't leave your dog locked in a cage for years, but we do it to people in our country. That was a lot of the points that they were making. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of going back to prison labor, I'm just going to have the documentary had one of the scholars there define the prison industrial complex. And he said it refers to the system of mass incarceration and companies that profit from mass incarceration. So that plays into a lot of the major companies relying on prison labor, a lot of how we said the phone calls, a lot of the phone companies installing their phones in jails and just spiking the rates to make as much profit as possible off of these people. And so now we're going to kind of move into modern day politicians in the criminal justice system. But I'm also going to catch us up. In 2014, the prison population was 2,306,200 people. For reference, in 1970, it was 357,292.
Right. So I can't do the math on the spot, but
I cannot either. But that's a ridiculous spike.
Yeah. Yeah. And near the end of the movie, they start to show now statistics, and they say that Black men make up 6.5% of the U.S. population, but they also make up 40.2% of the prison population. And it says that 1 in 3 young Black men are expected to be in prison at least once in their lifetime, right? And for white men, I believe it was 1 in 17.
It is.
Right. So, yeah.
So one of the scholars said that essentially he reflected back on the timeline we've been kind of referencing this whole time. And he said, he went from slavery to 100 years of terror, lynching, and segregation, got the right to vote, then they broke out the handcuffs. And if you get labeled a felon, you can no longer vote. So a lot of people are attributing this new kind of felon policy where you can't vote if you're a felon to being like the new Jim Crow, the legal Jim Crow kind of fitted to modern times.
Right. And they say that, like, even though, like, you're supposed to get back into society after imprisonment, you're not really getting back into society because you can't vote. You can't decide on laws, which is a huge part of being in America. So
exactly. Yeah. A professor who was in the documentary at the University of Pennsylvania, she said you might not be eligible for student loans. Cory Booker, a senator, said that you can't apply for food stamps. There's so many things. I mean, on every job application you ever see, it asks, are you a convicted felon? Have you been charged with anything? These are all questions that we ask, and that will affect you once you leave the prison system, if you even do get out. And in prison, there's hardly any rehabilitation kind of practices there. You mostly just do your time, and when you get out, everyone says, okay, you served your time, welcome back to society. But a lot of the times for convicted felons, what are you coming back to?
Exactly.
So next we'll move on. We're kind of, as you see, moving more into modern times, and now we're going to touch on Ferguson, Missouri, and Mike Brown.
Right.
Okay, so a lot of this happened. Mike Brown, as we know, was murdered, and that sparked another kind of wave of protests, especially in Ferguson, Missouri. And a lot of the people, not only were they protesting for justice for Mike Brown, they were almost waking up to the pattern of mass criminalization and mass incarceration. In Ferguson, Missouri, there was an average of 3 warrants per household, and the people felt as if they were seen as enemies of the state.
Yeah, and there was this one scene where they showed the people kind of going against the police, and you could see like this like unity of a community, you know, and like they were like taking videos, and there was no violence. It was just kind of like a standoff kind of thing, and it was very interesting to see. I loved in the movie how they like went back and forth between like kind of little film excerpts from like the 70s and 80s all the way to now, all the way to like just scholars commenting and like the audios. I loved how they just kind of made it feel historical and like kind of entertaining at the same time. You know, some people get bored with that kind of stuff, but I was honestly entertained.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with documentaries, it's so easy for documentaries to be kind of drawn out and just the bland narrator just over a bunch of scenes. This documentary was not like that at all. Even though it was an hour and 40 minutes, I promise it feels so much shorter because of the way that everything is edited together, the just clever use of voiceovers, the music weaving together all the different important segments of this documentary. It truly did an excellent job. It's eye-opening, educational. I absolutely think it's worth a watch.
For sure. I mean, the music was incredible. I loved it.
Absolutely. I mean, didn't you even say that they won multiple awards for the music or something?
Yeah. They were nominated for an Academy Award. They won an Emmy. Plenty of things. I believe they won something for their music. Yeah, it was. I personally, that was like one of my favorite parts. How they kind of made this like segue in between like different topics with the music.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember watching this in 2016 when it first came out, and having watched it again recently to do this stream, it's gotten better with time. It's educational. It's really, really moving. That's what I'll put it to. It's really moving. It's worth the watch. Absolutely.
Right.
So,
no, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say that's all I have. Do you want anything to add?
No, I think that's
all
it.
Right. I think we pretty much covered anything. Let us know if you watched the documentary 13th, if you've watched it before. Let us know what you think about it. And then join us again next Tuesday at 7 p.m. We're going to be talking about Marriage Story. It's available on Netflix. So thank you for tuning in. All right.
Thank you. Bye.
No worries. Bye.